Welcome to Pseudobiblia. Today, Pseudobiblia presents The Strange Case of the March Burr, an unpublished Sherlock Holmes tale, first part. A novel written by Atanasio Pernati. Enjoy listening. The Strange Case of the March Burr. Preface. There are cases in a chronicler's career which, owing to their delicate nature or the implications they might generate amongst the public, cannot be committed to print. However, their importance in the formation of character and in the understanding of human nature is such that they deserve to be preserved, if only for the memory of those who lived through them. The case I am about to narrate belongs to this category. I shall never be able to publish it, neither during my illustrious friend's lifetime nor after my own. Too dangerous would be the details it contains, too easily obtainable the instruments of evil of which it treats. Yet I feel it my duty to set it down on paper, for it marked a turning point in my long collaboration with Sherlock Holmes, and perhaps, permit me this presumption, in his very conception of the world. It was March of 1904, and London was preparing to shake off winter with that timid hope which characterizes our spring. I had been a widower for some months, having lost my dear Mary too recently, and perhaps for this reason I was more sensitive than usual to the subtle emotional currents that flow through the human soul. Holmes, for his part, seemed to be passing through one of those periods of intense intellectual activity that always preceded his most significant cases. I could never have imagined that a simple burr resembling that of a chestnut, found out of season on a Fleet Street pavement, would open before us an abyss of deception, grief, and, I dare say, of a compassion as misplaced as it was tragically sincere. I write these lines in the hope that one day, when the times are ripe and the dangers averted, someone may understand how even the art of deduction, however refined, must sometimes bow before the mysteries of the human heart. John H. Watson, M.D. London, Summer 1904. Part 1. The Mystery Presents Itself. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Visitor and an Unusual Problem. It was one of those March mornings, when London seemed still undecided whether to make room for spring or remain faithful to winter's rigors. A fine, persistent drizzle, almost a dusting of icy water, veiled the outlines of buildings and transformed the pavements into dark mirrors, reflecting the leaden sky. I had just concluded my morning rounds, still feeling the dampness that crept beneath my overcoat collar, when I returned to our familiar lodgings at 221 B. Baker Street. As I climbed the familiar stairs, whose wood creaked beneath my steps with a melody that time had rendered almost comforting, I heard from the sitting room a voice that was unknown to me. It was not Holmes's calm and reflective tone, nor the busy muttering of our good Mrs. Hudson. This voice was harsh, with a querulous undertone and a cadence which, while striving to imitate the manners of good society, betrayed more modest origins and a character little accustomed to disinterested courtesy. I pushed open the door and entered. Holmes, as often happened when he was immersed in a problem, was seated in his favorite wicker armchair, his long, tapering fingers interlaced beneath his chin, his gray and penetrating eyes fixed upon the man who sat opposite him. The latter occupied the chair usually reserved for our clients, and his figure emanated an aura of studied, albeit slightly worn, respectability. "Ah, Watson," Holmes greeted me, without shifting his gaze from his interlocutor, which indicated to me that the matter under examination was of some interest. "Do sit down, I pray you. Mr. Grubb, correct me if I err, sir, was just expounding to me a rather singular affair, which might stimulate your professional curiosity as well." My gaze fell upon the man. He was middle-aged, with the air of one who had known better times and clung tenaciously to an appearance of respectability. He wore an elegant frock coat, but the fabric was worn at the elbows and the collar slightly frayed, signs of prolonged use and domestic repairs. His hair thinning on top, and his beard, cut with a certain pretense at accuracy, but lacking the expert hand of a barber, suggested an attention to personal economy that bordered on avarice. A silver watch, not gold as one might have expected from a man of his apparent position, peeped from his waistcoat, and his shoes, though polished, showed the unmistakable signs of more than one risoling. Holmes, I was certain, had already catalogued these and other details in his infallible mental archive. Mr. Grubb cleared his throat, a dry and unpleasant sound. "Dr. Watson, honored," he croaked, with a stiff nod of his head. Then, turning to Holmes with a tone that oscillated between offended importance and supplication, he resumed. "As I was saying, Mr. Holmes, I am the proprietor of a rather respectable building in Fleet Street. Business, you know, offices mostly, some apartments on the upper floors for quiet folk. And these quiet tenants have begun to show signs of unrest, I presume." Holmes interjected, with a flash of interest in his eyes. "Unrest? Mr. Holmes, that's a euphemism," exclaimed Grubb, his voice rising an octave. "They complain. Night visions, they say. Frightful nightmares, demonic apparitions, whispers in the darkness. Stuff to make your flesh creep. I'm a practical man, Mr. Holmes. I don't believe in this nonsense. Ghosts and spirits don't pay the rent. But the thing is becoming a serious problem. 2 families have already left, and I fear others will follow. The reputation of my building suffers, and with it, my income." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "Have there been recent changes in the building? New tenants, perhaps?" Grubb nodded vigorously. "Exactly so. About 2 months ago, a group of people, men and women, all young, elegantly dressed, with impeccable references that seemed too good to be true, rented the large apartment on the 3rd floor. It had been vacant for some time, you know, a bit run down. They paid 6 months in advance, in ready cash, saying they were a collective of scholars, researchers, perhaps artists. Something rather vague, but the money was good. "And these scholars have made modifications to the apartment, I imagine?" asked Holmes, drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair. "Modifications?" Grubb snorted. "They wanted to renovate everything at their own expense. They knocked down partitions, erected new walls, thin as tissue paper according to the other tenants, repainted everything in the strangest colors, dark on one side, stark white on the other. They brought their own furniture, some antique, others modern and bizarre in appearance. I, as a practical man," and here he puffed out his chest slightly, "consented. Saving on renovation costs seemed a good bargain. Typical of a miser, I thought to myself. And when you tried to speak with these artists about the disturbances complained of by the other tenants, what was their response? Courteous, Mr. Holmes, far too courteous, but evasive. They mutter something about studying metaphysical phenomena, about exploring other dimensions of reality. Words, just words. Meanwhile, my rents are falling." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Grubb. It was clear he had grasped the crux of the matter. The landlord's concern was not so much for the psychological and physical well-being of his tenants as for the missing jingle of coins in his pockets. "Mr. Grubb," Holmes said finally, in a professional tone, "my fee for cases of this nature is 3 guineas per day, plus expenses. Do you accept?" I distinctly saw the inner conflict paint itself across our visitor's face. His eyebrows furrowed, his lips tightened, his hand went unconsciously to clutch the silver watch chain. It was a considerable sum, but the prospect of further losses was evidently more frightening. "I accept," he sighed at last, with the air of one signing his own death warrant. "But I beg you, Mr. Holmes, be quick about it, and with the utmost discretion. I don't want this story ending up in the newspapers." "Speed and discretion are my speciality, Mr. Grubb," Holmes replied, rising to accompany him to the door. As Grubb made his way down the stairs, Holmes added, with an enigmatic smile our client could not see, "And I assure you this case will prove far more interesting than either of us can imagine." Once the sound of Grubb's footsteps had died away, Holmes turned to me, his eyes shining with an almost feverish excitement. "Watson, my dear fellow, what say you to an invigorating walk to Fleet Street? It is time to make the acquaintance of these singular scholars, and to take a closer look at the theater of their alleged metaphysical experiments." Chapter 2, Voices in the Dark, and an Elderly Tenant's Lament. The Fleet Street building presented itself as a solid red brick edifice, well-maintained in itself, typical of the commercial and residential architecture of that area. However, as we approached, Holmes's infallible eye fixed upon the 3rd-floor windows. Beyond the extremely heavy dark curtains that precluded any view, he noticed something else. "Man's hand has heavily tampered up there, Watson," he commented in a low voice. The rhythm and proportions of the windows have been sacrificed. Look, here an opening has clearly been reduced. There another seems almost makeshift, inserted where structural logic would not predict it. Whoever made those internal modifications cared not at all for the building's external harmony, a sign of overriding and perhaps particular internal requirements. At the entrance, a stocky and good-natured porter with a ruddy nose that suggested a certain predilection for spirits, scrutinized us with curiosity. Holmes, with consummate skill, presented himself as Mr. Sherrington, a gentleman interested in viewing a potentially vacant apartment for himself, for me, and for our sister, who would soon be joining us in town. The porter, softened by the prospect of a possible tip and by Holmes's affected courtesy, allowed us to look around. As we climbed the time-worn stairs, ideally heading towards the upper floors, we encountered an elderly lady descending slowly, gripping the banister. She was dressed with neat simplicity, but her face was ashen and marked by deep shadows beneath her eyes. Her hands, gloved in black, trembled visibly as they clutched a small handbag. Holmes stopped, removing his hat with a gesture of exquisite courtesy. "Forgive the interruption, madam. We are the Sherringtons, and we were considering the possibility of taking an apartment in this building. But we have heard vague rumors of nocturnal disturbances. Could you tell us something about it?" The lady started, and her eyes, clear and frightened, fixed upon Holmes. "Disturbances," she murmured, her voice faint. "Gentlemen, if I may give you dispassionate advice, look elsewhere. I myself, after 30 years living here, am seriously thinking of leaving. I can bear it no longer." She hugged herself, as if feeling a sudden chill. "Could you be more specific, miss?" Holmes began gently. "Aldrich, Miss Aldrich," she replied. "At first," she continued, lowering her voice as if she feared being overheard, "it was just noises. Footsteps in the corridor above, objects falling. Then I began to see shadows from the corner of my eye, long and thin, moving rapidly." She paused, swallowing with difficulty. "But in recent weeks, it's worsened. I've seen figures, gentlemen, dark figures, tall, sometimes bent in unnatural ways, shapes that didn't seem entirely human. A shiver ran down my spine, despite my professional skepticism. And then there are the smells," Miss Aldrich went on, wringing her gloved hands. "Strange smells, sometimes sickly sweet, almost cloying, other times acrid and pungent. They seem to come from everywhere, creeping under doors, through cracks in the floor." Her eyes filled with tears. "And the nightmares, horrible, deformed faces staring at me in the dark, voices whispering terrible things, promises and threats. All this began after the arrival of the new tenants on the third floor, did it not?" asked Holmes, his tone still calm. Miss Aldrich nodded vehemently. "Yes, since those scholars arrived with their so-called experiments. Strange lights can be seen coming from their windows at impossible hours of the night, and muffled sounds, like heavy furniture being dragged back and forth. Sometimes, a kind of music, if one can call it that, sharp, dissonant sounds that don't seem of this world." She paused again, then added in a thread of voice, "My cat, Tom, who has never been afraid of anything, now categorically refuses to go beyond the first-floor landing. His fur stands on end, and he hisses as if he sees the devil himself." Holmes looked at her with a sympathetic expression. "Miss Aldrich, I believe you would do well to accept the invitation of some relative or friend and remove yourself from here for a few days. A bit of fresh country air would do you good." "Perhaps you're right," she admitted with a weary sigh. "I thank you for your kindness, gentlemen." She nodded to us and continued her descent, a shadow of her former self. When we were back in the street, Holmes remained silent for a long stretch, his face thoughtful. "Watson," he said at last, "there is far more here than simple mass suggestion or frayed nerves. The details provided by Miss Aldrich are too specific, too consistent. Those figures, those smells. Someone is staging an elaborate charade, and I fear with purposes far from noble." Chapter 3. A Fruit Out of Season and a Visit to the Duchess. We had just left the building, and Holmes had stopped on the opposite pavement, observing once more the third-floor windows, as if trying to penetrate with his gaze the heavy curtains that concealed their secrets. The drizzle had ceased to fall, but the air was still damp, and a cold wind swept Fleet Street, lifting scraps of paper and dry leaves. As we walked slowly, discussing the oddities of the case, my gaze was drawn to a small dark object half hidden beneath the edge of a gutter, near the bare trunk of a young tree struggling for survival in that urban context. Instinctively, I bent to examine it more closely. It seemed like a chestnut burr, but something about its form was unusual. "Holmes," I called, "look here." Holmes's interest was immediate and palpable. He examined it with a contained excitement that barely showed through his usual aplomb. His gray eyes gleamed. "Watson," he said, with a note of subdued triumph in his voice, "I fear you have just made a discovery of considerable, indeed, of fundamental importance, given that it is March and chestnuts are quite out of season." With extreme care, Holmes extracted from his pocket a clean linen handkerchief. He delicately wrapped the mysterious burr in it and carefully placed it in the outermost pocket of his overcoat. He had not touched it with bare hands, I noted. "And now, Watson," he announced, straightening up, "I must immediately pay a visit to the Duchess of Marlborough. Do you recall the case of her missing poodle, Pom Pom? Her vast knowledge of high society circles might be of great help in confirming a suspicion that is beginning to take shape in my mind." I was more perplexed than ever. The Duchess of Marlborough, what connection can she have with this? Spiny fruit and the nightmares of Fleet Street. Holmes gave me one of his most enigmatic smiles. "All in good time, Watson. For now, I advise you to return to your practice and await news from me." He left me thus, on the threshold of an even denser mystery, with the distinct feeling that that small, insignificant spiny object concealed secrets far greater and more disturbing than I could imagine. As I made my way home, my mind struggled to find connections and explanations that eluded me. Part 2. Holmes's Investigation and the Plan. Chapter 4. A Summons to Baker Street and Attire for the Occasion. The afternoon passed slowly in my surgery. Patients were few, and my mind continued to wander, returning incessantly to the case, to the mysterious Burr, to Holmes's sibylline words, and to the disturbing atmosphere of the Fleet Street building. The terrified figure of Miss Aldrich returned vividly before my eyes, and I wondered what diabolical machination lay behind her fears. Shortly after 5 o'clock, as I was tidying my papers, a messenger boy knocked at the door, delivering a telegram. I opened it with some trepidation. A few incisive words, in my friend's unmistakable style. "WATSON, come 80 once Baker Street, 7:30 p.m. Stop. Evening dress essential stop. Important developments. Stop. HOLMES. Important developments and evening dress. What could he possibly have in mind?" I hastened to close the surgery and made my way home. Once there, I opened the wardrobe and took out my best evening clothes, those I had worn at my wedding to my dear late Mary. Only a few months had passed since her death, and in taking them in my hands, a wave of melancholy gripped my heart. Trying them on, I noted with a sigh that they were a bit tight at the waist. Time, and perhaps not always frugal dinners, had left their mark. I arrived at 221B Baker Street a few minutes early. On the threshold, as I was about to ring the bell, I encountered Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, who was leaving. He had a perplexed and slightly irritated air. "Good evening, Dr. Watson," he greeted me with a nod of his head. "Your friend is in a particularly cryptic mood tonight, or perhaps I should say demanding. He has asked me to have some men ready for the night and to procure some powerful acetylene lanterns. Well, I just hope he knows what he's doing." I shook my head with an understanding smile and entered. Holmes stood before the fireplace, impeccable in his evening dress, his chin resting on one hand, his gaze lost in the flames. He turned at my entrance, and a flash of amusement crossed his gray eyes. "Ah, Watson, excellent. I see you have chosen the attire of a solemn occasion from about, let me see, 8 or 9 years ago, have you not?" he said, with that sharp yet good-natured manner of his. Time and life's vicissitudes leave their mark, even on the finest cloth, eh? His tone was light, but I could not help noticing the subtle, almost imperceptible note of understanding in his voice, which did not directly touch the still fresh wound of my loss, but brushed it delicately. "I fear so, Holmes," I admitted, trying to disguise a slight embarrassment. But I am ready. What are these important developments? Holmes smiled. Patience, my dear Watson. First dinner, and then action. I have reserved a table at Linguini's. I believe you will appreciate it. Chapter 5. Table Conversation and the Outlines of a Bold Plan. The restaurant, Linguini, nestled in a discreet Soho side street, proved an excellent choice on Holmes's part. The ambience was intimate and elegant, without any ostentation. The soft light from gas lamps, screened by amber silk shades, cast a warm glow on the few well-spaced tables, ensuring privacy and tranquility. An inviting aroma of fresh herbs and rich, slowly cooked sauces permeated the air, whetting the appetite. We were greeted at the entrance by Giuseppe himself, the proprietor and head chef, a corpulent and jovial man with imposing black mustaches turned upward and an immaculate apron. He greeted Holmes with the warm effusion reserved for a long-standing client of particular regard. Signor Holmes, what an honor, what a pleasure to see you again. And Dr. Watson, finally. I have personally prepared the Vincegrassi as per your request this morning. A masterpiece, if I may say so. He accompanied us to our table, a secluded corner with a comfortable red velvet banquette. On Holmes's advice, we ordered without hesitation the house speciality, that sumptuous marquet preparation my friend had praised on several occasions, and a bottle of robust Barolo which, he said, would enhance every nuance. While we waited for the dishes to be served, Holmes, contrary to his habit of going straight to the point when absorbed in a case, seemed to want to digress, as if to ease the tension that both of us, I believe, felt growing in view of the evening ahead. "Watson," he began, observing with interest a painting on the wall depicting a view of Naples, "have you ever noticed how the arts, apparently so distant from one another, often vibrate in unison with the spirit of the times, as if they were strings of the same invisible instrument?" "I fear I don't quite follow you, Holmes," I replied, sipping my glass of wine. "Take music, for example," he continued, his eyes now wandering around the room. "It is a period of great ferment, of radical changes. There is animated discussion in the most up-to-date circles of apparently technical questions, such as the pitch of the reference A for orchestral tuning. It seems a trifle, yet it reflects deeper tensions. There are those who push for an ever brighter, sharper sound, as if to express the electricity, the urgency of our advancing century. I recently had occasion to hear some scores by a young and promising Austrian composer, a certain Mahler. His writing for strings, so tense, so vibrant, seems almost to want to unhinge the harmonic certainties of the past. I listened, as always, fascinated by the breadth of my friend's interests, which ranged from criminology to the history of medieval music with equal apparent ease. However, I wondered where he was leading the conversation. The Vincegrassi arrived at that moment, served in individual tureens that emanated a heavenly aroma of rich ragu, creamy bechamel, and, I suspected, a generous grating of black truffle. For some minutes, we devoted ourselves in silence to that culinary marvel, appreciating every morsel. The Barolo, austere and complex, magnificently completed its richness. It was only when our plates were almost empty that Holmes set down his fork. His gaze, when it fixed on me above his wine glass, had returned to that of the sharp and focused detective. The parenthesis of erudite digression was concluded. "Crime, Watson," he resumed, his voice now low and incisive, "like music, adapts to the times. We are no longer dealing with the crude ruffians of old. Today, the most dangerous deceptions are those that cloak themselves in science, in philosophy, that exploit the most intimate weaknesses of the human soul with an almost artistic refinement." He paused, allowing his words to take effect. Then, lowering his voice further, he outlined the plan he had conceived for the evening. "And now, to our plan. This evening, the two of us shall infiltrate one of their séances." He took a sip of Barolo. "You, Watson, will be Sir Henry Kent, a respectable physician recently retired from practice, whose heart is broken by the loss of his only beloved daughter, little Lucy, taken at a tender age by a cruel childhood illness. Your part, my dear friend, will be that of the grief-stricken father, vulnerable, almost desperate, but with a foundation of dignity that will inspire trust and perhaps a certain carelessness on the part of our hosts. A shadow crossed Holmes's eyes, as if he understood the emotional weight that role might have on me, given my recent loss. I, he continued, with a slightly different tone, more calculated, shall be Lord Julian Wayne, a country gentleman, apparently solid but inwardly destroyed by the recent and tragic death of his young wife, which occurred in sudden and never fully clarified circumstances. But there is an important nuance, Watson. The Duchess of Marlborough, besides giving me valuable information about this environment, which, it appears, is much frequented by people of high society in London, has put me in contact with a person who will be fundamental to our infiltration. Her niece, Lady Elena Vance, who will be present and whom I have already met, considers me a scholar, a discreet investigator of psychic phenomena, interested in studying with seriousness and an open mind the methods of Master Thorne. Not a credulous fool, mind you, but a rigorous scholar. This will guarantee us privileged access, and at the same time, a certain freedom of observation that a simple grieving client would not have. I was astounded, but Holmes, it's almost a double deception. Precisely, Watson. We must be convincing on multiple levels. These individuals are cunning. They choose their victims carefully, study their vulnerabilities. Our cover must be impeccable. But are you certain it's a fraud? Miss Aldrich seemed genuinely terrified. An enigmatic smile curved Holmes's lips. Fear, Watson, can be induced as much as visions, but I shall not anticipate all my conclusions. For now, suffice it to know that we are about to enter the den of extremely cunning individuals, and I fear, devoid of scruples. He leaned towards me. Lady Elena Vance, as I was saying, has been informed that I wish to study the phenomenon, and that to do so I require discretion, hence our aliases. She does not know the full extent of my suspicions about Thorne's fraudulence, but her desire for truth, combined with a certain confidence in my analytical abilities mentioned to her by her aunt, has convinced her to help us. She will be our unwitting key to access, and at the same time, a valuable witness to our seriousness of intent. A woman of great intelligence and sensitivity, unfortunately also fallen into the web of these charlatans after the premature death of her husband, Charles, a noted theosophist scholar and collaborator of Alan Octavian Hume in India. I had a conversation with Lady Vance this afternoon. I explained my suspicions to her with due caution. Although initially shocked and incredulous, her acumen and desire for truth prevailed. She has agreed to help us. She will be present this evening, officially as one of the participants in the séance, but in reality as our valuable ally. She will confirm our false identities and provide us with discreet support from within. We left the restaurant shortly after, the echo of Holmes's words still resonating in my mind. Apprehension for the evening ahead was palpable, but it was mitigated by unwavering confidence in my friend's abilities and determination to unmask a deception that promised to be as cruel as it was ingenious. Part 3. The Séance. Chapter 6. The Unexpected Ally and the Antechamber of Illusions. It was almost 10 o'clock in the evening when our carriage stopped again before the Fleet Street building. A soft, golden light filtered through the heavy third-floor curtains, giving the building an almost spectral aura in the darkness of the street. Lady Elena Vance awaited us just inside the entrance, a tall and dignified figure wrapped in an elegant mourning dress of deep purple. Her face, pale but composed, betrayed a profound suffering, but her clear eyes shone with quiet determination. Lord Wayne, Sir Henry, Lady Elena Vance greeted us with a slight nod of her head, using our aliases with a seriousness that underlined the importance she attached to our presence. Her face, elegant in its sadness, lit up with contained hope. I am immensely grateful that you have agreed to come. My aunt, the Duchess, has spoken to me of the depth of your investigations into the less understood phenomena of human nature, Lord Wayne. I have high hopes that your acute observation and vast experience might shed new light on these communications. Perhaps you will succeed in grasping truths that escape us, immersed as we are in our grief. Master Thorne is undoubtedly a man of great powers, but every external and qualified perspective is welcome. Lady Vance, Holmes replied, in his role as Lord Wayne, with a tone of grave and respectful understanding. My interest in the mechanisms of the mind and in experiences that transcend the ordinary is deep and sincere. We are here with open minds to observe with the utmost attention and to seek to understand. Your trust honors us. We climbed the stairs in silence. The porter dozed in his lodge, and the building seemed wrapped in an unnatural expectancy. Having reached the third floor, we were shown into what must once have been a large antechamber, now transformed into a waiting room with a peculiar atmosphere. Thick oriental carpets muffled our steps, antique-looking furniture was arranged with studied casualness, and the subdued lighting created an intimate, almost private atmosphere. 3 other people were already present in the antechamber. The first was a woman with flowing raven hair who introduced herself as Lady Araminta. She spoke vivaciously of her poor Algernon, a poet who had died prematurely of consumption, and as she spoke, I noticed that she gesticulated with grace, perhaps excessive, the kind of movements one acquires when accustomed to capturing attention. But the pain in her eyes seemed genuine, and when she asked us, with delicate courtesy, about our lost loved ones, I saw nothing more than the natural search for comfort among kindred souls in grief. The mention of losses and bereavements gripped my heart. The memory of Mary was still too fresh, too painful. Perhaps it was for this reason that my usual powers of observation became slightly clouded, or perhaps it was already the charged atmosphere of the room beginning to influence me. Beside Lady Araminta sat a middle-aged man of shabby appearance, with an unkempt beard and reddened eyes. He introduced himself as Sir Geoffrey, stammering something about a dear young friend who had passed away whilst blushing visibly. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable, like someone who finds himself in a place where he would prefer not to be, but circumstances compel him to frequent. The last participant was Mrs. Pemberton, a robust woman in her 50s, widow of an industrialist. She had that practical air of people accustomed to managing a household and servants. But in her eyes, one could read a vulnerability she tried to mask with brusque manners. A tall, thin man with a discreet bearing moved among us with silent steps. He introduced himself as Roger, in the service of Master Thorne. He had deferential but not servile manners, and as he offered us drinks, an aromatic tea, I noticed he moved with the grace of one accustomed to not being noticed. "A special blend," he explained as he handed me the steaming cup. "The master has it prepared especially for these occasions. It helps calm the nerves and open the mind." Lady Araminta accepted her cup with a smile. "Oh, I know these infusions well," she said. "They served them in the Parisian salons I frequented with Algernon. He always said that art requires a certain receptivity of spirit." The tea had a pleasant taste, with notes of chamomile and something more exotic I couldn't identify. As I sipped it, Holmes had one of his small accidents. He dropped his handkerchief, and in bending to retrieve it, with a quick movement invisible to the others, he spilled its contents on an ornamental plant beside him. As for me, I had neither the opportunity nor the daring to do likewise, as Lady Araminta constantly engaged me in her discussions, continuously fixing her eyes upon me. I continued to sip my tea while conversation flowed quietly around me. Lady Vance was telling Mrs. Pemberton in a low voice about her late husband, and something in the way the 2 women exchanged confidences moved me. Shared grief creates strange bonds between strangers. As time passed, I felt a pleasant sensation of warmth spreading from the center of my being. It wasn't unpleasant. Indeed, after the tension of recent hours, it was almost welcome. The contours of the room seemed to soften slightly, as if seen through a veil of gauze, and sounds reached my ears with a muffled, almost dreamlike quality. It was in this state of growing torpor that I heard Roger announce that Master Thorne was ready to receive us. As we rose to follow him, I noticed that my movements were slightly slowed, as if the air had become denser. But it wasn't an alarming sensation. Rather, I felt strangely protected, as if wrapped in an invisible blanket that cushioned the harshness of the world. Lady Araminta took my arm naturally as we proceeded towards the dark corridor. "Courage, Sir Henry," she whispered. "I know what it means to hope to see those we love again. The heart breaks, and mends itself 1,000 times in these moments. Her words in my growing mental fog seemed to me of moving depth and sincerity. I nodded, unable to respond, while the memory of Mary and of the daughter we had so longed for tightened my throat. Thus we entered the séance room, carrying with us our hopes, our sorrows, and, at least in my case, a mind already slightly altered by what I would only later understand to have been a far more calculated preparation than it appeared. Chapter 7. The Black Room and the Beginning of the Ceremony. Towards 11:30, when the atmosphere in the antechamber had become charged with an almost palpable expectancy, Roger announced that Master Thorne was ready to receive us. He led us through a short dark corridor to a massive door, which he opened with solemnity. We entered the communication room. The impact was immediate and disturbing. The room was completely black. The walls, ceiling, and even the floor were covered in heavy dark velvet that absorbed every reflection. Heavy curtains draped at the windows prevented any glimmer of outside light from filtering through. The only illumination came from a few oil lamps of ancient and vaguely exotic design, strategically placed to create deep shadows and an atmosphere dense with mystery. In the center of the room, a large round table covered with a pitch-black cloth was surrounded by 6 black chairs, also of severe design. Seated in a dominant position, facing the entrance, was a man I presumed to be Alistair Thorne. He was an imposing figure, with a long grey beard that descended to his chest and dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to scrutinize directly into one's soul. He wore a broad, dark robe, similar to that of a magician or priest of some archaic cult. Before him, on the table, were arranged a parchment that appeared to be an astrological map and some Nordic runes scattered with apparent casualness. Roger showed us to our seats. Holmes was placed to my right, Lady Vance to my left. I noticed, with a fleeting sensation of discomfort, that my chair had a very slight, almost imperceptible rocking motion. Initially, I attributed it to a manufacturing defect or an irregularity in the floor, almost as a characteristic intended to provide an unexpected, albeit minimal, comfort. When we were all seated, Alistair Thorne cleared his throat, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in the still air of the room. "Welcome," he said, with a magnetic and persuasive tone. "Welcome, afflicted souls seeking comfort, spirits yearning at the threshold of mystery. I am Alistair Thorne, and I shall be your humble guide in the realm beyond the veil, where the souls of our dear ones await to communicate." He paused, his gaze passing slowly from face to face. As the great masters taught, from Madame Blavatsky to Emanuel Swedenborg, the barrier between worlds is thin, and with proper preparation, it can be crossed. The séance began. Thorne murmured some invocations in a language that seemed to me a mixture of mangled Latin and phrases with an exotic and incomprehensible sound. Then he addressed Lady Araminta and Lady Vance, who were seated opposite him. "Concentrate, my dears," he whispered. "Visualize your beloved ones, Algernon, Charles, feel their presence." He began to describe, in vague but evocative terms, the supposed features and character of the two deceased. As he spoke, I noticed that, with an almost imperceptible movement, he had placed his hands on the backs of Araminta's and Lady Vance's chairs. The chairs began to rock with a light, rhythmic, almost lulling movement. Simultaneously, Thorne took a small screened lantern and began to move it slowly before the two women's eyes, with slow, circular movements, like a hypnotic pendulum. "Let yourselves go," Thorne murmured, his voice a deep drone. "Feel the soul gently separating from the body. The journey towards the light, towards Swedenborg's room, the place of meeting, a realm of peace and infinite brightness." I observed Araminta and Lady Vance. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light, became progressively more relaxed. Their eyes became glassy, their breathing slow and deep. Without interrupting the subdued flow of his words, Thorne, leaving the two women apparently immersed in their spiritual torpor, though to my eyes they were simply asleep or deeply suggestible, shifted his attention and the luminous circle of his lantern towards the second pair of participants, the bearded nobleman, Sir Geoffrey, and the industrialist's widow, Mrs. Pemberton. "And now you, patient souls," he murmured, his voice a whisper that seemed to insinuate itself directly into the mind. For you too, the doors are opening. Concentrate on your desire, on the call of your dear ones. With them too began the slow, rhythmic rocking of the chairs, a movement so light that had I not been alert, I would barely have perceived it, and the oscillating play of the lantern. Sir Geoffrey seemed to yield almost immediately, his head reclining slightly, a sigh escaping his lips. But Mrs. Pemberton, whose pragmatic air I had noticed from the beginning, stiffened. Just as Thorn was intensifying his evocative formulas, the widow burst out, her voice, though contained, charged with a palpable irritation that jarred with the mystical atmosphere. "Excuse me, Master Thorn," she said, with a note of typically British impatience, "but I haven't shelled out 50 guineas in ready money, which for a widow like me is no trifle, to be rocked like a child on a fairground ride, and to listen to these fine words. When do we start seeing something concrete?" Chapter 8, Disappearances, Apparitions, and the Heartbreaking Vision. An enigmatic smile, almost of challenge, curved Alastair Thorne's lips at Mrs. Pemberton's protest. For an instant, I feared her irritation might compromise the entire performance. Instead, the master seemed to seize the opportunity. "My dear lady," he replied with an icy calm that contrasted with the woman's agitation, troubled states of mind, skepticism, impatience. "These are the true obstacles. They attract minor demons, evil spirits that seek to interfere with our sacred work." His voice became deeper, magnetic, and I saw Mrs. Pemberton and Sir Geoffrey start slightly under his imperious gaze. "Now, I pray you, calm yourselves. Open your minds, or you will see nothing." Their chairs resumed that hypnotic rocking while the lantern wove its circles of light. Then, with a theatrical gesture worthy of the best West End actor, Thorne lifted his main lantern, the one illuminating the center of the table, and with a swift movement directed it towards the seats occupied by Araminta and Lady Vance. A cone of more intense light fell on those two chairs. They were empty. A muffled "oh" escaped Mrs. Pemberton, who brought a hand to her mouth. Sir Geoffrey's eyes widened, his already florid complexion becoming, if possible, even more flushed. I myself, though prepared for some trick, could not help but feel a surge of surprise at that apparently inexplicable disappearance. Only Holmes, beside me, remained impassive, but I would swear I caught an almost imperceptible flicker of amused approval in his grey eyes. "As you can see," Thorne announced in a triumphant voice, "the more receptive souls have already begun their journey." Without giving us time to process this, he turned to us, to Lord Wayne and Sir Henry Kent. "And now, gentlemen, it is your turn. Your grief is great, your hope ardent." The slight rocking of my chair became more perceptible, and the light of the lantern that Thorne now moved before our eyes began to dance hypnotically. It was at that moment that, from the corner of my eye, I saw Holmes bring a hand to his nose, as if for a fleeting, insistent itch. For just an instant, I shifted my gaze from the light and fixed it on my friend. And in that moment, by the flickering light, I had the strangest, fleeting impression that his aquiline nose appeared slightly larger, almost snub, as if something were stuck to it. I shook my head imperceptibly, attributing that bizarre perception to fatigue, tension, and perhaps the already incipient effects of the tea I had drunk. Thorne, with two more broad and solemn gestures, and a whisper that spoke of bridges between worlds and returning spirits, again shifted the main beam of his lantern. To my great dismay, I saw that Lady Vance and Araminta were once more seated in their places, eyes closed, a smile of ethereal beatitude painted on their faces. But even more disconcerting, the seats of Mrs. Pemberton and Sir Geoffrey were now empty. The rocking of my chair continued, relentless, and the light of the lantern became ever more insistent, almost painful. I noticed, through eyelids that were growing heavy, that the gazes of Lady Vance and Araminta, if one could speak of gazes, given their dreamy expression, were fixed in the void, lost in a sort of trance that seemed halfway between deep sleep and intoxicated ecstasy. I was about to succumb to that strange drowsiness myself, the contours of the room beginning to blur, when, with a last flash of clouded lucidity, I seemed to see, or perhaps imagined, the figures of the industrialist's wife and the old bearded nobleman briefly reappear in their places, like trembling shadows reflected in a misted mirror. Then all perception of the real world vanished. I found myself, or seemed to find myself, in a completely dark corridor of velvety and absolute darkness. At the far end, very distant but intensely bright, pulsed a white light, almost blinding. I felt, without moving a muscle of my physical body, that I was moving, or rather, being gently transported, towards that light, which grew ever larger, ever closer, promising who knows what revelation. I looked out, or was pushed, onto the threshold of a room flooded with that snowy, diffused light. It was a sparse, almost austere environment. The furniture was simple, essential: a small bench of rough wood, a table that seemed roughly carved from a tree trunk, a terracotta jug. Everything seemed the work of a carpenter from a remote era, perhaps the 1st century after Christ, as I had read in some ancient text, and the walls themselves seemed made of condensed light. And there, at the center of that seemingly supernatural radiance, I saw a figure. It was a little girl. She could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She wore a simple white tunic. Her hair, blonde, almost golden, fell over her shoulders in soft ringlets, and her eyes, of an intense and purest blue, fixed on me with an expression of disarming sweetness and innocence. When her gaze met mine, a most sweet smile, a smile I seemed to know all too well, illuminated her face. "Papa, do you recognize me? I'm Lucy," she exclaimed, her voice a crystalline tinkling. Lucy, the name Holmes had assigned me for my part, the daughter Sir Henry Kent had tragically lost. But in that moment, in that unreal light, that name and that voice merged with a far older and deeper desire, that of the daughter my dear Mary and I had so dreamed of, and that fate had never granted us. The Lucy of fiction and the Lucy of my heart overlapped, and the child before me became, for my clouded mind and yearning soul, the incarnation of both. "Papa, how are you?" she continued, her voice seeming to spring from the most intimate recesses of my memory, the voice I had always imagined for my little, beloved one. "You were so kind to come and visit me." She beckoned me to sit beside her on the bench. I obeyed, my body shaken by an uncontrollable tremor, my heart beating wildly in my chest, threatening to suffocate me. "I'm well here, Papa," she went on. "The spirit world is a beautiful place, you know, especially for those like me who have been judged positively. And I'm not alone. There are many children here, and so many beautiful souls." With a vague gesture of her little hand, she indicated indistinct figures, luminous shadows that seemed to dance and play beyond the diaphanous walls, as if these were only a thin veil between worlds, a ballet of eternal innocence. "You just have to be a bit careful of those ones," she added, and her little voice became for an instant more serious, almost a worried whisper, as she pointed to a darker shadow, huddled in a distant corner of my distorted vision, on which I seemed to glimpse the profile of small, sharp horns. "But with time," she immediately resumed with a reassuring smile that banished that disturbing image, "you learn to avoid them, and they can't do anything to us. Now I must go, Papa. Do take care of yourself, and don't be too sad." I was overwhelmed. A wave of emotion so powerful as to take my breath away, to annihilate any remaining capacity for reasoning, swept over me. Hot, uncontrollable tears began to flow down my cheeks, and I wept like a child, without restraint, clutching that little hand that seemed so tangible, so alive. In that harrowing confusion of feelings, I no longer understood, or perhaps no longer wanted to understand, where the part I was playing ended, that of the grieving father Holmes had assigned me, and where the reality of my heart began. Was that luminous and innocent creature before me truly my daughter, and why Lucy, an unexpected gift from heaven, a miracle that, for one blessed instant, eased the pain still so vivid and burning for the loss of my Mary, grief for my departed wife, hope for a fatherhood never lived, incredulity before this prodigy, and a paternal love, long dormant and now awakened with devastating force, mingled in a whirlwind that clouded my mind and tore at my soul. "Papa, I really must go now," the child repeated gently. I felt my strength fail me, my vision blur, as if I were about to plunge into an abyss of darkness and loneliness. I was about to faint, to yield to that vortex of unbearable sensations, when a violent sound, completely incongruous with the celestial sweetness of that vision, tore through the ethereal atmosphere. A loud, rending noise of breaking glass, followed immediately by the sharp, powerful and graceless sound of a hunting horn blowing at full volume, a long, out-of-tune and terribly, brutally earthly call. The vision of Lucy and the white room vanished instantly like a bursting soap bubble. Then came darkness. End of part 1. You have listened to the first part of the case of the March Burr, an unpublished Sherlock Holmes tale, a pseudo-biblia narration. We hope you enjoyed this journey. The second part will be available on this channel next Friday at 9 p.m. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for a new audiobook every Friday and explore our playlists for other genres. Thank you for listening. This work is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and events are the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any reference to real people, events, or places, existing or having existed, is purely coincidental.